Annie Phillips wanted out of a bad relationship, Roberta Avero wanted free of a marriage, drowning in alcohol, and Donashia Kastner just wanted to raise her son in peace. Their lives never crossed. The only thing they shared was knowing a man named Eugene Barrett, and on the streets of Honolulu, Hawaii, that man eventually killed them. From the shooting in 1959 to the stabbing in 1972 to the murder in 1995, this U.S. Army veteran committed 3 killings over the course of 36 years, becoming Hawaii's first confirmed serial killer. And in 2 of those murders, he should not even have been out on the streets. He should have been in prison. Eugene Barrett was born on June 30th, 1931, in Oakland, California, the older of 2 sons to Howard and Emily. He dropped out of Washington Intermediate School in Honolulu after 9th grade. Then, he joined the Army and fought in the Korean War. Later, in 1955, at 24, the Army threw him out with a dishonorably discharge for his excessive drinking. The next few years, he returned to Honolulu and scraped by as a house painter. There, through his mother, Emily, he met Annie Phillips. Annie and her husband Edward had 5 kids. Edward worked as a steamship crewman, while Annie stayed home with the children. With the marriage mostly spent apart, Annie decided to divorce Edward and take up with Barrett. She even promised to marry him and have his child. But the relationship was shaky from the start. Barrett could not hold a job, and his drinking only got worse. So in January 1959, Annie told him their relationship was over and she was going back to Edward, trying to catch things up, aiming to get the family back together. Perhaps through their time together, she had come to understand what kind of person Barrett was, that he loved her so much, he did not care about other women, was willing to marry her, and would even take in her 5 children, but she had no idea that Barrett would be driven to madness by the breakup. On March 7th, 1959, Barrett armed himself with a gun, got on a bus to Annie's apartment complex in Mayor Wright Homes, and forced his way into her apartment. Then he walked straight through the living room where 2 of her kids were watching television and headed into the bedroom where Annie was tending to her youngest child. Then he pulled out his gun and shot her multiple times. Minutes later, a neighbor who had heard the gunfire rushed over and stopped Barrett. The neighbor later told reporters that the only thing he said was, "I surrender." By the time Barrett was subdued, the apartment hallway was packed with neighbors drawn by the shots. Then, Joseph, Annie's brother, came running out of the apartment, stood in front of the restrained Barrett, looked him dead in the eyes, and said, "You're satisfied you killed my sister?" Barrett's answer, "She deserved it." Police arrived shortly after and arrested him. As they put him in the car, the only thing Barrett said to them was, "Hey, is Wahine dead or what?" Meanwhile, when the doctor finished with the scene, he determined Annie was dead from at least 3 gunshot wounds to her neck, back, and chest. The bedroom closet was scattered with clothes. She had apparently been folding laundry, tidying up, when Barrett struck with chilling precision, shooting her from behind. After his arrest, Barrett was taken in for questioning. He told the interrogators that he had been drinking all day the day before the shooting, and then, around 4:30 p.m. that day, he took a bus to Annie's apartment. He remembered walking into Annie's room with a gun, but could not remember the shooting itself. On March 9th, Barrett was formally charged with murder. During the subsequent trial, Joseph took the stand and walked the jury through what happened. After Annie told Barrett they were breaking up, she had been living under constant threat and he had made a point of staying at the apartment regularly to protect her. Another of Annie's brothers testified that weeks before the shooting, Barrett had told him, "If I can't have her, no one will." And Barrett kept repeating the same defense, that he had absolutely no memory of any of it, that all he knew was Joseph and his brother and some neighbors had beaten him up, and he can remember nothing of the crime. On June 19th, the final day of the trial, Prosecutor Frederick began his closing argument. He argued that one cannot blame voluntary drunkenness for murder. Not a single witness said he looked drunk, and when he was trying to get away, he was even threatening other people. A drunk could not have done these things. These actions belie his story of drunkenness. He said, "The girl gave him his walking papers and he killed her. That's all there is to it." In the end, Barrett was convicted of second-degree murder and given a life sentence. But Annie's murder happened before Hawaii officially became the 50th U.S. state. Under territorial law at the time, a life sentence could not be handed down for second-degree murder. So Barrett got sentenced to 15 to 50 years. Even with the reduced term, even with parole hearings coming up sooner, he was still looking at decades in prison. However, later on, Hawaii's then governor, the second governor, John Burns, commuted his minimum imprisonment term to 8 years for unknown reasons. There's no official record regarding Burns's specific motivation for the sentence reduction. One unverified speculation suggests that it was related to intense disputes within the state government at the time over the cost, capacity, and land use of a proposed new prison. Due to budget and land issues, he had to make efforts to control costs and capacity and made certain decisions, including alleviating prison pressure by shortening inmates' sentences. Barrett was one of them. Not only was his sentence reduced, but he was also granted parole and released from prison. In the early afternoon of December 27, 1972, at the Hawaii Hotel rooming house, a bloodied woman stumbled out of one of the rooms and collapsed in the courtyard. By the time police got there, she was dead. They found multiple stab wounds across her body. But before they could even identify her, Barrett called the police from a nearby bar and turned himself in. Later, the victim was identified as Roberta Avero, his ex-wife. They had been married less than 2 years. After getting out of prison, Barrett had met Roberta. They married and had a child, Robert. But the marriage was tense from day one. Barrett drank himself into oblivion every day, ignoring her and the baby. So that November, Roberta filed for a divorce. However, barely a month later, Barrett tracked her down at the Hawaii Hotel, grabbed a kitchen knife, and stabbed her repeatedly until she was dead. After his arrest, the Oahu grand jury returned an indictment against Barrett for second-degree murder. Then, Barrett, through his attorney, cut a deal with the prosecution and got the charge knocked down to manslaughter. On February 9, 1973, in court, he waived his right to trial and asked to be sentenced immediately. He was then sentenced to 10 years in prison. Later, after yet another parole release, Barrett spent the rest of the 1980s living a relatively quiet life in an apartment on Kainau Street in Honolulu. But his emotional instability never went away. He still drank all day, every day. During this period, he became fixated on his neighbor, 41-year-old Donishia Kastner, a single mother with a complicated history of drug use and sexual abuse who was doing her best to raise her 7-year-old son, Ethan. There was never any relationship between Barrett and Kastner, but Barrett privately accused her multiple times of mocking him, of dating other men while not dating him. Some of Barrett's friends later said he would sometimes call them in a state of hysteria, saying he was afraid he might hurt her. After another episode of this paranoid behavior, Barrett voluntarily asked to be admitted for psychiatric treatment at the Queens Medical Center, where he stayed until August 1995. But the long-term treatment did nothing to fix him. In the days after his release, he spent most of his time drinking beer with his brother and a friend. However, on the 11th, while he was at a local store buying medicine, he saw Kastner. He had assumed she had moved out of the neighborhood entirely, but she had merely moved into an apartment across the street, which infuriated him. Then he went back to his apartment, grabbed a stolen .25 5-caliber semi-automatic pistol, crossed the street, walked past Ethan playing in front of the building, entered Kastner's room, and fired 2 shots into her head. After the gunshot rang out at home, Ethan ran straight inside, saw Barrett leaving the room, and found his mother's body. Then he told his father and called the police. Police launched a manhunt for Barrett. The following day, Barrett entered the Columbia Inn and begged the manager to call the police for him. After his arrest, Barrett faced charges of murder, theft, and illegal possession of a firearm. But reporters quickly picked up on the fact that, in spite of 2 prior murder convictions, he had only served a total of 17 years in prison. Days later, a reporter interviewed the chief of the Hawaii Paroling Authority, Claudio Siat. Siat explained that when Barrett had come up for parole previously, the board's files did not disclose why earlier officials had released him early. But he made it clear that a modern appeals board would never approve such an early release. He said, "In today's climate, this simply does not happen." On August 15th, Barrett pleaded not guilty to second-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm. The court initially set bail at $120,000. Then, Deputy Prosecutor Randy was able to successfully argue that his bail be revoked because he was a threat to the community. "He has killed 3 people already," he told the court. At the subsequent preliminary hearing, Kastner's 7-year-old son Ethan took the stand, making him one of the youngest witnesses in Hawaii's history. Ethan testified that after hearing the gunshots, he saw Barrett leaving the room, then found his mother's body. Neighbor Enrique corroborated this, telling the court he had heard 2 or 3 shots followed by the sound of a boy crying. At trial, Barrett's attorney argued that Barrett acted because he believed Kastner had treated him badly, that this pushed him too far and he killed her in a fit of anger. Barrett himself claimed the same thing, saying he wanted to kill the bitch for constantly choosing all the other guys over him. This did not succeed in swaying the jury. They found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison. At the sentencing hearing, the judge said, "He must be removed from society. He should have been removed a long time ago. If the law did not conform with his belief structure, then he would choose to violate it. The only deterrent is to remove the defendant from society." The deputy prosecutor added, "It will operate as a de facto life without parole sentence, and he will never get out. It's taken us 3 deaths to get him where we want him." Barrett's 3 victims all had emotional relationships with him, or at least relationships he believed existed, following the pattern of an intimate partner killing. He became obsessively possessive over relationships that were not even real, and when these women rejected him or tried to get away from him, his ego was hurt. Then he would use violence to regain control, and that violence almost always ended in murder. Alcohol ran through all 3 crimes. In the first case, he used intoxication as his defense. The second marriage collapsed under his drinking. In the third, he had just gotten out of the hospital and was drinking again, and the alcohol brought back all his angry feelings and made him lose control. But that was never the real reason. He was aggressive and controlling even without alcohol. Drinking just let out the violence that was already inside him. On November 8, 2003, Barrett died at 72 from an undisclosed illness. 3 murders, 3 convictions. His crimes stretched across 36 years. His mother, Emily, defended him from the time of the first murder, but in the end, she could only watch her eldest son become a notorious serial killer. The son he had with Roberta was told that his father had killed his mother, so he spent his entire life hating his father.